Hey loves, welcome back to Love in Chapters. Today's story is a little longer than usual, but I truly poured my heart into it. Every scene, every word, just for you. So grab a cozy spot, relax, and let yourself get lost in this journey. As you're listening, please drop a comment to let us know what time it is and where in the world you're watching from. I absolutely love seeing how far our stories reach. And if this story touches your heart even just a little, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us grow and reach more beautiful souls like you. Now, let's dive in. The first rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, casting a golden glow across the sprawling Hamilton estate. Kayla Johnson stood on the mansion's grand balcony, her father's old Canon camera pressed gently against her eye as she captured the breathtaking sunrise. The camera was weathered and well-loved, its black body worn smooth from years of use, but it still worked perfectly, just like her father had promised it would when he placed it in her 8-year-old hands all those years ago. "Beautiful shot, sweetheart," came a warm voice behind her. Kayla lowered the camera and turned to see Grace Hamilton approaching with a steaming cup of coffee, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. Even at 7 in the morning, Grace looked elegant in her silk robe, her graying hair perfectly styled. "Thank you, Mrs. Hamilton," Kayla said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The light was too perfect to miss. "You know you don't have to call me that, after all these years," Grace chided gently, the same conversation they'd had countless times since Kayla was 11. "Your family, dear." Family. The word still warmed Kayla's heart after 15 years of living in the Hamilton mansion. After her father's sudden death from a heart attack, her world had crumbled until Grace and Walter Hamilton opened their home to her and her mother. What started as a job opportunity for her mother as their live-in chef had blossomed into something far more precious, a second family. "Mom's already in the kitchen?" Kayla asked, inhaling the rich aroma of her coffee. "Of course. You know how she is about breakfast preparation. Speaking of which, Tiffany's still in bed, naturally." Grace shook her head with fond exasperation. "That girl would sleep until noon if we let her." As if summoned by their conversation, Tiffany Hamilton burst through the balcony doors in her pajamas, her hair a wild mess around her shoulders. At 26, she still had the boundless energy of someone half her age. "Did someone say my name?" Tiffany yawned dramatically, then immediately perked up when she saw Kayla's camera. "Ooh, sunrise shots. Let me see." Kayla handed over the camera, watching as her best friend scrolled through the images with genuine appreciation. Despite their different backgrounds, she and Tiffany had been inseparable since that first day when 11-year-old Kayla had arrived, scared and grieving. Tiffany had simply taken her hand and declared they were going to be best friends forever. And they had been. "These are incredible, Kayla," Tiffany breathed, pausing on a particularly stunning shot where the light seemed to dance across the mansion's gardens. "I still don't understand why you're wasting your talent at that boring marketing firm." "Because talent doesn't pay the bills," Kayla replied with a rueful smile, the same answer she always gave. She loved photography with every fiber of her being, but she'd learned to be practical. The small marketing firm where she worked wasn't glamorous, but it provided steady income while she built her photography portfolio on the side. "But look at this. This is art, Kayla, real art." Tiffany gestured emphatically at the camera's display. "Remember when we used to read all those romance novels about following your dreams and finding your passion? I also remember you having a crush on every bad boy hero in those books." Kayla laughed, deflecting as she always did when the conversation turned to her unfulfilled dreams. "Speaking of which," Tiffany grinned mischievously, "Zach's band is playing at the Riverside Club tonight. Want to come?" Grace's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but Kayla caught it. The Hamiltons had never approved of Tiffany's relationship with Zach Morrison, a struggling musician whose primary talent seemed to be spending Tiffany's money. "I can't tonight," Kayla said diplomatically, "I have a client consultation for a wedding shoot." It wasn't entirely true. The consultation was via phone and would only take an hour. But Kayla had learned to avoid Tiffany's adventures with Zach. Something about the way he looked at Tiffany, like she was a means to an end rather than a person, made Kayla's protective instincts flare. Across the city, Nicholas Anderson sat rigidly in his wheelchair, his jaw clenched as his physical therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, demonstrated a series of standing exercises. "I want you to try supporting your weight on your arms first." Dr. Chen explained patiently, her voice carefully neutral. "Just for a few seconds. The goal isn't to walk today, Nicholas. It's simply to remind your body that it can." "No." The word came out sharp and final. Dr. Chen paused, her experienced eyes studying his face. "Nicholas, we've discussed this. The accident damaged your confidence, not your spine. You have full function in your legs. The blocks you're experiencing are you quite finished?" Nicholas's voice could have frozen water. His cold blue eyes stared straight ahead, refusing to meet her gaze. "Because I have a conference call in 20 minutes. Dr. Chen sighed, making notes on her tablet. "This is our 15th session, and you haven't attempted a single exercise. If you're not willing to do the work, then perhaps we should discontinue these sessions." Nicholas reached for the wheels of his chair with sharp, precise movements. "I've managed perfectly well for the past 2 years." He wheeled himself out of the therapy room without another word, leaving Dr. Chen shaking her head in frustration. Nicholas had heard the same lecture countless times, that his paralysis was psychological, not physical, that he was choosing not to walk rather than being unable to, as if it were that simple. As if he hadn't tried everything in those first desperate months after the accident. The elevator ride to the parking garage was mercifully silent. Nicholas transferred himself into his specially modified Mercedes with practiced efficiency, folding his wheelchair with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything in his life. Control. Order. No surprises, no disappointments, no one close enough to betray him. His penthouse apartment reflected this philosophy perfectly. Everything was pristine, minimalist, and coldly beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city, but Nicholas rarely bothered to admire it. He wheeled himself to his home office, a space dominated by multiple monitors and the latest technology money could buy. As he settled behind his desk, a flash of memory struck him unbidden. Charlotte's laughter echoing through these same rooms 2 years ago, her blonde hair catching the lamplight as she curled up on his couch, reading. This apartment had felt warm then, alive with possibility and shared dreams. Nicholas crushed the memory ruthlessly. Charlotte was gone, had been gone since that devastating night when he'd found her in their bed with his former business partner. The engagement ring he'd planned to give her that very evening had ended up at the bottom of the river, along with his ability to trust, to hope, to feel anything beyond the safety of controlled numbness. The accident had been his own fault, driving angry and heartbroken through a thunderstorm, taking curves too fast, letting his emotions override his judgment. When he'd woken up from the coma a month later, unable to feel his legs, it had seemed like perfect justice. He'd lost everything that mattered anyway. What was the use of legs when you had nowhere worth walking to? His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant about quarterly reports. Nicholas welcomed the distraction, diving into spreadsheets and profit margins with the focused intensity that had made Anderson Investments one of the most successful firms in the city. Work was safe. Work was predictable. Work couldn't break your heart or leave you paralyzed on the side of a rain-slicked road. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Kayla was reviewing marketing layouts at her desk when her phone rang, displaying the Hamilton house number. "Kayla?" Grace's voice was strained, barely controlled. "You need to come to St. Mary's Hospital immediately. It's your mother." The world tilted sideways. Kayla's hands shook as she grabbed her purse and camera bag, barely managing to stammer an explanation to her supervisor before rushing out of the office. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and half-remembered prayers. She found Grace and Walter in the ICU waiting room, their faces etched with worry. Grace immediately pulled Kayla into a fierce hug. "What happened?" Kayla's voice came out smaller than she intended. "She collapsed in the kitchen," Walter explained, his usual commanding presence subdued. "Grace found her unconscious. The paramedics said it was likely a stroke." Dr. Martinez emerged from the ICU an hour later, his expression serious but not hopeless. "Ms. Johnson, I'm Dr. Martinez, your mother's attending physician. She's stable now, but I need to discuss her condition with you." Kayla's heart hammered as she followed him to a small consultation room, Grace and Walter flanking her like protective guardians. "Your mother suffered a significant stroke," Dr. Martinez began, consulting his tablet. "There's substantial blockage in several arteries. We can perform a procedure to clear them, but it's complex and expensive. The surgery itself will cost approximately $150,000, plus post-operative care, rehabilitation, medication. We're looking at around $200,000 total." The number hit Kayla like a physical blow. $200,000. She made $35,000 a year at the marketing firm. Her photography brought in maybe another $8,000 annually if she was lucky. Even if she sold everything she owned, even if she worked 3 jobs for the rest of her life, she could never raise that kind of money in time. "What happens if she doesn't have the surgery?" Kayla asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dr. Martinez's expression grew grave. "Without intervention, there's a high probability of another stroke within 6 months, likely fatal." The room seemed to spin around Kayla. She felt Grace's hand squeeze her shoulder, Walter's concerned murmur, but it all seemed to come from very far away. Her mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give Kayla a good life, who had worked tirelessly in the Hamilton kitchen with a smile on her face even when her own world had crumbled, might die because Kayla couldn't afford to save her. "We'll figure this out," Grace said firmly. "Kayla, sweetheart, we'll find a way." But as they sat in that sterile hospital room, watching the monitors that tracked her mother's fragile heartbeat, Kayla couldn't see how. The number 200,000 echoed in her mind like a death sentence, impossible and insurmountable. The Hamilton Industries boardroom felt like a tomb. Walter Hamilton sat at the head of the mahogany table, staring at spreadsheets that told the same devastating story no matter how many times he reviewed them. 20 years of careful business building, of following in his father's footsteps, was crumbling before his eyes. "The Meridian Group pulled out this morning," his CFO, James, reported grimly. "That's the last of our major investors." Grace sat beside Walter, her usually perfect composure cracked with worry. "How bad is it, really?" Walter rubbed his temples, feeling every one of his 58 years. "We're looking at bankruptcy within 3 months, maybe sooner. The bank has already indicated they'll begin foreclosure proceedings on the mansion by the end of the month." The mansion. 5 generations of Hamiltons had lived in that beautiful estate. Walter had brought Grace there as a bride, had watched Tiffany take her first steps in its grand foyer. And now Kayla and her mother lived there too, the family his own family had chosen to embrace. All of them would lose their home because he had failed to navigate the shifting business landscape. "There has to be something," Grace insisted. "Some option we haven't considered." James shuffled through his papers uncomfortably. "We've approached every potential investor in the region. The company's reputation took too severe a hit when the Patterson scandal broke. No one wants to risk association with Hamilton Industries right now." Walter stared out the boardroom window at the city below. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives, worrying about normal problems, not wondering how to tell their daughter that everything she'd known and loved was about to disappear. "What about overseas investors?" Grace suggested desperately. "Already tried. The Asian markets are too volatile right now, and European investors won't touch anything connected to the Patterson situation." James looked genuinely pained to be delivering such devastating news to the family who had employed him for 15 years. Walter's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Heard about your troubles. Perhaps we should talk. Cooper Anderson." Cooper Anderson. Walter hadn't spoken to him in years, though their fathers had once been close business partners. Cooper had built his own empire from the ground up, turning Anderson Investments into a multi-billion-dollar powerhouse. If anyone had the resources to help Hamilton Industries, it would be Cooper. But Walter also knew Cooper never did anything without expecting significant returns on his investments. Still, with bankruptcy looming and his family's future at stake, Walter was in no position to be choosy about potential saviors. "I need to make a phone call," Walter announced, rising from his chair with newfound purpose. "James, cancel the rest of our meetings for today." Cooper Anderson's office occupied the entire top floor of the Anderson Investments building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city skyline. At 62, Cooper was still an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that made people listen when he spoke. Walter Hamilton sat across from Cooper's massive desk, feeling like a supplicant seeking audience with a king. The contrast between their positions couldn't have been starker. Cooper relaxed and confident, Walter tense and desperate. "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice, Cooper," Walter began. "Nonsense. Our fathers were partners for 30 years. Besides," Cooper's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, "I've been following Hamilton Industries' difficulties with interest." Walter winced. "Then you know how dire our situation is." "Indeed. Bankruptcy within the quarter, I'd estimate. Perhaps sooner." Cooper leaned back in his leather chair, studying Walter with calculating eyes. "The question is, what are you willing to do to save your company?" "Anything," Walter answered without hesitation. "Name your terms." Cooper was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "I'm prepared to invest enough to not only save Hamilton Industries but to restore it to full profitability. No equity stake required, no board position demanded. Consider it a gift." Walter blinked in surprise. "That's incredibly generous, Cooper. What's the catch?" "Perceptive as always." Cooper smiled genuinely this time. "I have one son, Nicholas. Brilliant boy, though he's been through some difficulties recently. I want him to marry your daughter." "Tiffany?" Walter's voice came out strangled. "A marriage contract," Cooper continued smoothly. 2 years. After that period, both parties would be free to annul the arrangement if they chose. But for those 2 years, they would be legally married. Walter's mind reeled. "Cooper, one, that's a significant request. And I'm offering a significant sum in return. $15 million, Walter. Enough to clear your debts, restore your credit, and rebuild Hamilton Industries stronger than ever." $15 million. The number was staggering, far more than Walter had dared hope for. But the price? "Why?" Walter asked. "Why marriage? Why my daughter?" Cooper's expression grew thoughtful. "Nicholas needs stability. He needs something to ground him, to remind him there's more to life than work and isolation. Your daughter would provide that stability." "As for why her specifically?" Cooper paused. "I remember Tiffany from when she was small, a spirited child, full of life. Nicholas needs someone who can challenge him, bring him back to himself." Walter thought of Tiffany, wild, rebellious Tiffany, who was dating a musician against their wishes, who had never shown the slightest interest in marriage or responsibility. "I need time to consider this," Walter said carefully. "Of course, but don't take too long, Walter. My offer expires in 1 week." Cooper stood, signaling the end of their meeting. Sometimes the most unexpected arrangements lead to the most rewarding outcomes. As Walter left the Anderson building, his mind churned with possibilities and fears. $15 million could save everything: the company, the mansion, their entire way of life. But could he really ask Tiffany to sacrifice 2 years of her life for the family business? Could he live with himself if he did? By the time he reached home, Walter knew he was going to have to try. The Hamilton family meeting convened in Walter's study that evening, the room heavy with tension. Tiffany lounged in one of the leather armchairs, painting her nails a vibrant purple, seemingly oblivious to her parents' serious expressions. "Tiffany, please put that away," Grace said gently. "We need to discuss something important." "More important than my manicure?" Tiffany teased, but she capped the nail polish when she saw her father's face. "Okay, you both look like someone died. What's going on?" Walter cleared his throat, unsure how to begin. "The company is in serious financial trouble. We're facing bankruptcy." Tiffany's carefree expression faltered. "What? But I thought—" "I know what you thought, sweetheart. We've tried to shield you from the worst of it, but the situation has become untenable." Walter moved to the window, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. "We're going to lose the house, the company, everything. There might be a solution." Grace interjected quickly. "Cooper Anderson has made an offer." "Anderson Investments? That's wonderful." Tiffany brightened. "He'll invest in the company?" "In exchange for a marriage arrangement," Walter said quietly, "between you and his son Nicholas." The nail polish bottle slipped from Tiffany's fingers, clattering to the floor. "I'm sorry, what?" "It would be a contract marriage," Grace explained hurriedly. 2 years. After that, you could annul it if you chose to. But for those 2 years, are you both completely insane?" Tiffany shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "You want me to marry some random guy to save the company?" "Nicholas Anderson is hardly random," Walter protested. "He's successful, educated." "I don't care if he's Prince Charming himself." Tiffany's voice rose to a near shout. "I'm not going to sell myself like some medieval princess." "Tiffany, please, just listen." "No, this is ridiculous. And anyway, I'm already seeing someone." Grace's expression tightened. "That musician?" "Tiffany, he's not serious about you. He's just." "Just what? Poor? Not good enough for the Hamilton family?" Tiffany's eyes blazed with defiance. "At least Zach loves me for who I am, not for what I can do for his bank account." "This isn't about class," Walter said desperately. "This is about survival. If we don't take Cooper's offer, we lose everything. Everything, Tiffany." "Then lose it." Tiffany grabbed her purse from the side table. "I'd rather live in a cardboard box than marry someone I don't love." "Where are you going?" Grace called as Tiffany headed for the door. "To find someone who actually cares about my happiness instead of their profit margins." The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving Walter and Grace staring at each other in stunned silence. Tiffany's hands shook as she packed clothes into her overnight bag, tears of anger and hurt streaming down her face. How could her parents ask this of her? How could they think she would simply agree to sacrifice her life for their business? Her phone buzzed with a text from Zach. "Band practice canceled. Want to hang out?" Without hesitation, Tiffany typed back, "Pick me up in 20 minutes. And pack a bag. We're leaving town." "Seriously? Where are we going?" "Vegas. Let's get married." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. If her parents wanted her married so badly, fine. She'd marry the person she actually loved, not some cold businessman chosen for his bank account. By the time Zach arrived in his beat-up van, Tiffany had filled 2 suitcases and written a note for her parents. She left it propped against her mirror, knowing Grace would find it when she came to check on her later. "Mom and Dad," the letter read, "I'm sorry it came to this, but I won't be your bargaining chip. I've gone to marry someone who loves me for myself, not for what I can do for his family's business. Don't try to find me. I hope you find another way to save the company. Love, Tiffany." "You sure about this, babe?" Zach asked as they pulled out of the mansion's driveway. "Marriage is pretty permanent." "Not as permanent as selling my soul," Tiffany replied, watching her childhood home disappear in the side mirror. "Besides, don't you want to marry me?" Zach's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Tiffany caught it. Something cold settled in her stomach, but she pushed the feeling aside. She was angry, hurt, and making decisions with her heart instead of her head, but at least she was making her own choices. "Course I do," Zach said finally. "Just surprised is all. Your parents gonna cut you off for this?" "Probably." The word tasted bitter, but that's their choice. As they drove through the night toward Vegas, Tiffany tried not to think about the life she was leaving behind or the family she was abandoning in their hour of greatest need. She told herself she was choosing love over duty, freedom over obligation. She tried very hard not to wonder if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Grace found Tiffany's note at 11 p.m., her daughter's empty room telling the story before she even read the words. With trembling hands, she carried the letter downstairs to Walter's study, where he was nursing a glass of whiskey and staring into the fireplace. "She's gone," Grace whispered, handing him the note. Walter read it twice before the words fully penetrated. "Vegas," he said numbly. "She's eloping with that musician." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their failure pressing down on them. Without Tiffany, there was no marriage arrangement. Without the marriage arrangement, there was no investment from Cooper Anderson. They were back to bankruptcy, foreclosure, and the loss of everything they'd built. "What do we tell Cooper?" Grace asked finally. "The truth, I suppose." Walter crumpled the letter in his fist. "That our daughter chose her own path." Grace stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mansion's gardens where Kayla often took her photographs. "Walter," she said slowly, "Cooper said he remembered Tiffany as a small child, from that birthday party when she was 5. Yes, that was 21 years ago. Do you think he'd recognize her now?" Walter looked up sharply. "Grace, what are you suggesting?" "Kayla," Grace said simply. "They're nearly the same age, similar complexion. Cooper has no idea what Tiffany looks like as an adult. You want to substitute Kayla for our daughter?" Walter's voice was incredulous. "Grace, that's our only option." Grace turned from the window, her expression determined. "Kayla needs money for her mother's surgery. We need money to save the company. And Cooper Anderson needs a bride for his son." Walter stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Even if Kayla agreed, which is a massive assumption, it would be fraud. We'd be lying to Cooper about who she is. "Would we?" Cooper asked for the Hamilton daughter. "As far as I'm concerned, Kayla has been our daughter in every way that matters for 15 years. The rationalization felt thin, but Walter found himself considering it seriously. Kayla was intelligent, kind, and beautiful. She had more grace and poise than Tiffany had ever shown. And she was desperate. Desperate enough to consider almost anything to save her mother's life. "It's madness," Walter said, but his tone lacked conviction. "It's survival," Grace countered. "For all of us." They found Kayla in the hospital the next morning, sitting beside her mother's bed and holding her hand. She looked exhausted, her usual bright demeanor dimmed by worry and sleepless nights. "Kayla, dear," Grace said gently, "could we speak with you privately?" In the hospital corridor, under harsh fluorescent lights, Walter and Grace explained their proposal. They watched Kayla's face cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally, desperate consideration. "You want me to pretend to be Tiffany?" Kayla asked slowly. "To marry a complete stranger?" "It would only be for 2 years," Grace said quickly. "A contract marriage, and in exchange, Cooper would provide the $15 million we need to save the company, plus we'd ensure your mother gets the best possible care." Kayla looked through the window at her mother, unconscious and fragile in the hospital bed. $200,000 for the surgery, money that might as well be $1 million for all her ability to raise it. "What if he finds out?" Kayla asked. "What if Cooper Anderson realizes I'm not really your daughter?" "He won't," Walter said with more confidence than he felt. "Cooper barely knew Tiffany as a child. He has no reason to suspect deception." Kayla closed her eyes, weighing an impossible decision. Save her mother and the family that had given her everything, at the cost of 2 years of her life married to a stranger. Or watch her mother die while the Hamiltons lost their home and livelihood. "This Nicholas Anderson," she said finally. "What's he like?" Walter and Grace exchanged glances. They knew very little about Cooper's son beyond his business reputation and recent reclusiveness. "Successful," Walter offered. "Intelligent. Cooper speaks of him with great respect." It wasn't much to base a life-altering decision on, but as Kayla looked at her mother's still form, she realized she didn't have a choice. "All right," she whispered. "I'll do it." Cooper Anderson found his son in the Penthouse apartment's home office, as he had every evening for the past 2 years. Nicholas sat behind his massive desk, focused intently on his computer screens, the rest of the world effectively shut out. "Nicholas," Cooper said, settling into one of the leather chairs facing the desk. "We need to talk. If this is about the Meridian account, I've already restructured the entire portfolio." Nicholas replied without looking up. "Profits should increase by 12% next quarter. It's not about business." Cooper waited until Nicholas finally raised his eyes. "It's about your future." Nicholas's expression grew wary. "My future is fine as it is." "Is it? When was the last time you left this apartment for anything other than work? When did you last have a conversation with another human being that wasn't about profit margins? I fail to see how that's relevant to anything." Cooper leaned forward. "I'm planning to retire within the next 2 years. The board needs to see that my successor is stable, grounded, capable of leadership beyond pure business acumen. And you question my capabilities?" Nicholas's voice grew dangerously quiet. "I question your humanity," Cooper said bluntly. "You've become a machine, Nicholas. Brilliant, efficient, but utterly isolated. The board members have families, social connections. They need to trust that the company's leader understands people, not just spreadsheets." Nicholas wheeled his chair back from the desk, his jaw clenched. "Get to the point. I've arranged a marriage for you. 2 years contract basis. The Hamilton family has agreed to the terms." The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Nicholas stared at his father with an expression of complete disbelief. "A marriage," Nicholas repeated slowly. "You've arranged a marriage. Her name is Tiffany Hamilton. I knew her as a child, spirited, intelligent. She'll be good for you." "Good for me?" Nicholas's laugh was bitter. "Like Charlotte was good for me?" Cooper's expression softened slightly. "This is different. This is an arrangement with clear terms and expectations. No deception, no false promises of love. Just a business transaction." "Exactly. Something you can understand and control." Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his wheelchair's armrest. Cooper watched his son's face, seeing the internal struggle between his need for control and his resistance to change. "What do you get out of this arrangement?" Nicholas asked finally. "The salvation of an old family friend's business. Walter Hamilton is facing bankruptcy. And I get a wife who's only marrying me for money. You get a companion who won't expect more than you're willing to give." Cooper corrected. "Someone who understands this is temporary, practical. No messy emotions, no unrealistic expectations." It was, Nicholas realized, exactly what he should want. A relationship with clear boundaries, defined terms, and a guaranteed end date. No risk of betrayal because there would be no genuine emotional investment from either party. 2 years, Nicholas said. 2 years. "And after that?" "After that, you'll be CEO of Anderson Investments, with a board that trusts your judgment, and she'll be free to pursue whatever life she chooses." Nicholas stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, a woman named Tiffany Hamilton was agreeing to spend 2 years of her life married to a stranger. He wondered what kind of desperation had driven her to such an arrangement, then realized he didn't particularly care. This wasn't about emotion or connection. It was about necessity, mutual benefit, and the kind of controlled relationship he could handle without risking his carefully maintained defenses. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll do it." Cooper smiled, relief evident in his expression. "I think you'll find this arrangement more beneficial than you expect." As his father left the apartment, Nicholas turned back to his computer screens. In 3 days, he would meet his contractual bride. In a week, they would be married. In 2 years, they would part ways as strangers who had shared nothing more than legal documents and living space. It was exactly what he wanted. It was safe, predictable, and utterly devoid of the kind of emotional risk that had once left him broken on the side of a rain-soaked road. So why did the thought of it make him feel more empty than ever? The courthouse ceremony lasted exactly 17 minutes. Kayla had timed it, watching the clock on the sterile government office wall as she repeated vows that felt hollow and mechanical. The justice of the peace, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, had tried to inject some warmth into the proceedings, but both bride and groom remained rigidly formal throughout. "You may kiss the bride," the official announced with a hopeful smile. Nicholas and Kayla looked at each other for the first time during the entire ceremony. His blue eyes were cold and distant, studying her face with the same detachment he might show a business contract. Kayla felt her cheeks flush under his scrutiny, suddenly aware of how surreal this moment was. Marrying a complete stranger in a gray government building, witnessed only by Cooper Anderson and a Hamilton family lawyer. "That won't be necessary," Nicholas said quietly, his voice carrying across the small room with uncomfortable finality. The justice of the peace blinked in surprise, but recovered quickly. "Well then, congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson. Your marriage certificate will be ready in about 10 minutes. Mrs. Anderson." The name felt foreign on Kayla's tongue as she signed the official documents with slightly trembling hands. She was no longer Kayla Johnson, no longer even pretending to be Tiffany Hamilton. She was now legally bound to the man sitting silently beside her, his signature bold and decisive next to her more tentative script. Cooper Anderson seemed pleased with the proceedings, shaking hands with both of them and speaking about dinner plans that neither Nicholas nor Kayla responded to with enthusiasm. The Hamilton family lawyer looked relieved to have the legal requirements fulfilled. Only Kayla and Nicholas seemed to understand the weight of what they'd just committed to. 2 years of shared life with someone who was essentially a stranger. "The apartment is ready," Nicholas said as they left the courthouse. His first words directed to her since, "I do. My driver will collect your belongings from the Hamilton residence this afternoon." "Thank you," Kayla replied, clutching her small bouquet of white roses that Grace had insisted she carry. They felt ridiculous now, a romantic touch in what had been purely a business transaction. Nicholas's penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of a sleek downtown building, all glass and steel and modern lines that spoke of wealth and aesthetic distance. Kayla stood in the entrance hall, feeling distinctly out of place among the expensive minimalist furniture and abstract art. "Your room is down the hall to the right," Nicholas said, wheeling past her toward what appeared to be a home office. "Mine is to the left. The kitchen is fully stocked. Housekeeping comes twice a week." He paused at his office doorway, seeming to remember something. "I work late most evenings. I trust that won't be a problem." "Of course not," Kayla said quickly. "I'll try to stay out of your way." Something flickered across Nicholas's face. Surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. But it was gone so quickly Kayla wondered if she'd imagined it. "The apartment is yours to use as you see fit," he said stiffly. "I've arranged for a credit card to be delivered tomorrow for household expenses and your personal needs." With that, he disappeared into his office, leaving Kayla alone in the expansive living space. She could hear the faint sound of his voice through the closed door, already on a business call despite having just gotten married 20 minutes ago. Kayla walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated the far wall, looking out at the city spread below. Somewhere out there, her mother was recovering from surgery that had been successful thanks to Cooper Anderson's money. The Hamilton family was beginning to rebuild their business and their lives. And here she was, in a beautiful apartment with a husband who had just made it clear that she was essentially an inconvenient houseguest. She touched her wedding ring, a simple platinum band that Nicholas had produced during the ceremony with business-like efficiency. It felt heavy on her finger, a constant reminder of the choice she'd made and the price she was paying for her family's salvation. The first week of marriage established a pattern that felt more like an elaborate form of polite estrangement than a shared life. Nicholas left for his office building each morning before Kayla woke up and returned well after she'd gone to bed. They passed each other in the hallway occasionally, exchanging brief nods and even briefer pleasantries about the weather or household matters. Kayla tried, at first, to bridge the chasm between them. She left coffee brewing in the morning, time to finish just as Nicholas usually departed. She attempted casual conversation about his work, about current events, about anything that might spark some form of human connection. His responses were invariably polite, brief, and delivered in the same tone he might use with a business acquaintance. "How was your day?" Kayla asked one Thursday evening, finding him in the kitchen getting a glass of water before disappearing into his office for another few hours of work. "Productive," Nicholas replied without looking at her. "Yours?" "I had a good phone consultation with a potential wedding client. They want to book me for next spring." "That's nice." The conversation died there, as they all did. Nicholas took his water and wheeled toward his office, leaving Kayla standing alone in the pristine kitchen, wondering why she kept trying to connect with someone who clearly had no interest in knowing her. The apartment itself began to feel like a luxury prison. Everything was beautiful and expensive and utterly impersonal. The walls were adorned with abstract art that said nothing about the man who lived here. The furniture was comfortable, but chose for aesthetic appeal rather than warmth. Even the books on the shelves were mostly business texts and technical manuals, with no hint of personal interests or passions. Kayla found herself spending most of her time in her bedroom, which had been clearly prepared for a guest rather than a wife. It was elegantly appointed but sterile, like an expensive hotel suite. The bed was comfortable, the view spectacular, but it felt temporary and unwelcoming. She was grateful when her belongings arrived from the Hamilton mansion: her father's old camera, her photography books, and a few personal items that made the space feel slightly more like home. The loneliness was unexpected and profound. Kayla had anticipated awkwardness, even conflict, but she hadn't prepared for the soul-deep isolation of living with someone who treated her like she was invisible. At the Hamilton mansion, she'd been surrounded by warmth and connection, even when Tiffany was being dramatic and the adults were stressed about business matters. Here, she felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Nicholas, for his part, seemed content with their arrangement. He worked, ate meals alone in his office, and spoke to her only when absolutely necessary. If he felt any curiosity about the woman he'd married, any desire to know her thoughts or dreams or fears, he showed no sign of it. Kayla began to wonder if he'd simply forgotten she existed during the long hours he spent behind his closed office door. By the second week, Kayla had grown desperate for some form of creative outlet. The beautiful apartment felt increasingly suffocating, and Nicholas's continued indifference was wearing on her spirit in ways she hadn't expected. She needed something that was hers, something that reminded her of who she was beyond this strange arrangement. She found the spare room at the end of the hall, another perfectly appointed space that served no apparent purpose except to showcase more expensive furniture. It had excellent natural light from two large windows, and when Kayla stood in the center of the room with her father's camera in her hands, she could almost imagine it transformed into a proper photography studio. "Nicholas." She knocked softly on his office door one evening, summoning the courage to make her first real request of him. "Come in." His voice was distracted, and when she entered, he didn't look up from his computer screens. "I was wondering if I could use the spare room as a photography studio," she said quickly, before she lost her nerve. "I'd be careful with your furniture, and I could move everything back if—" "Do whatever you like with it," Nicholas interrupted, still typing. "It's not being used for anything." "Thank you," Kayla said, but he was already absorbed in his work again, effectively dismissing her. The transformation of the spare room into her studio became Kayla's salvation over the following days. She moved the unnecessary furniture into storage and arranged her equipment with the careful precision of someone who had dreamed of having proper workspace for years. Her editing computer, her lighting equipment, her collection of photography books, everything found its place in the bright, airy room. For the first time since the wedding, Kayla felt like herself again. She spent hours editing photos from previous shoots, experimenting with new techniques, and planning future projects. The work absorbed her completely, providing blessed relief from the awkwardness of her living situation and the persistent loneliness of being married to someone who acted like she didn't exist. She was reviewing contact sheets from a recent engagement session when she heard the faint sound of Nicholas's wheelchair in the hallway outside her studio. The sound paused outside her door, and Kayla found herself holding her breath, wondering if he might actually be curious about what she was doing. But after a moment, the sound continued toward his own room, and she realized he'd just been passing by. The photography work also provided a practical benefit. It kept her busy and gave her something to focus on besides the strange reality of her marriage. She had several upcoming shoots scheduled, and the income would help her feel less dependent on the credit card Nicholas had provided for her expenses. Independence, even small amounts of it, felt crucial to maintaining her sanity in this surreal situation. Late at night, when the apartment was silent except for the distant hum of city traffic below, Kayla would sit in her studio and go through old photos on her computer. Pictures of the Hamilton family gatherings, of Tiffany's laugh, of her mother in the kitchen. The images reminded her of the life she'd had before this arrangement, and the life she hoped to return to once the 2 years were over. 3 weeks into their marriage, Kayla fell asleep in her studio for the first time. She'd been working late on a particularly challenging edit, trying to perfect the lighting in a series of portrait shots, when exhaustion finally overtook her. The last thing she remembered was resting her head on her arms at the desk, intending to close her eyes for just a moment. She woke to the gentle sensation of warmth settling over her shoulders. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in her childhood bedroom at the Hamilton mansion, with Grace tucking her in after she'd fallen asleep reading. But as consciousness returned, she realized she was still in her studio, slumped over her desk with a soft cashmere throw draped carefully around her. Kayla sat up slowly, her neck stiff from the awkward sleeping position. The throw was expensive and beautifully made, definitely not something that belonged in the spare room turned studio. She looked around the room, but she was alone, the door slightly ajar just as she'd left it the night before. Nicholas. It had to have been Nicholas who'd found her and covered her with the blanket. The realization sent an unexpected flutter through her chest, the first sign that her husband might possess some capacity for kindness beneath his cold exterior. She waited for him to mention it over the next few days, perhaps making some practical comment about proper sleep being important for productivity. But Nicholas said nothing, maintaining his usual pattern of polite distance and minimal conversation. If he'd been the one to cover her with the throw, he gave no indication of it. Kayla found herself studying his face during their brief encounters, looking for some hint of warmth or acknowledgement. But Nicholas remained as impassive as ever, his expression carefully neutral whenever their paths crossed in the apartment. Still, she kept the throw. It lived now on the small couch she'd moved into her studio, and sometimes when she was working late, she would pull it around her shoulders and allow herself to imagine that her husband might actually care about her well-being, even if he'd never admit it. The gesture, small as it was, gave her the first glimmer of hope that perhaps Nicholas Anderson wasn't entirely made of ice. Perhaps, buried beneath the layers of professional detachment and emotional armor, there was still a man capable of simple human kindness. Cooking had always been a source of comfort for Kayla. Growing up in the Hamilton mansion, she'd spent countless hours in the kitchen with her mother, learning family recipes and the kind of intuitive cooking that came from love rather than technique. In the sterile perfection of Nicholas's apartment, Preparing meals felt like a way to inject some warmth into the cold environment. Nicholas never ate dinner at home. This had become clear during their first week of marriage. He would return from work, grab something from the refrigerator, and disappear into his office to eat alone while continuing to work. The beautiful dining room table remained perpetually set but unused, like a museum display of how normal people might live. But on a Friday evening in their 4th week of marriage, Kayla decided to cook anyway. Perhaps it was the successful resolution of a difficult photo editing project, or maybe it was simply the need to do something nurturing and normal. But she found herself preparing her mother's recipe for herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables. The act of cooking felt therapeutic. The careful selection of ingredients, the precise timing, the way the apartment filled with the warm, homey scents of garlic and rosemary. For a few hours, she could pretend she was cooking for a family, for people who would appreciate the effort and the love that went into the meal. When Nicholas arrived home at his usual time, Kayla had already eaten and retreated to her studio. But she'd left the food on the dining room table, properly plated and still warm, with a simple place setting and a glass of the wine she'd found in his extensive collection. She heard him come in, the familiar sound of his wheelchair moving through the apartment. There was a pause, longer than usual, and she wondered if he was looking at the meal she'd prepared. Then came the expected sounds of him moving toward his office, and Kayla felt a familiar stab of disappointment. An hour later, working on uploading photos to her computer, she heard Nicholas's wheelchair in the hallway again. Curious despite herself, she crept to her studio door and peered out just in time to see him wheeling toward the dining room. Kayla held her breath, watching as Nicholas paused beside the table. For a long moment, he simply stared at the food she'd prepared. Then, slowly, he transferred himself from his wheelchair to one of the dining room chairs. From her hidden vantage point, Kayla watched her husband take his first bite of the meal she'd cooked. She saw his expression change subtly. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. He ate slowly, methodically, but she noticed he finished everything on the plate. When she ventured into the kitchen the next morning, she found the dishes washed and put away, the dining room table clear, except for a single white napkin folded neatly beside the place setting. There was no note, no acknowledgement of the meal, but the empty plates told their own story. That evening, Kayla cooked again. Nicholas prided himself on his observational skills. They were essential in business, allowing him to read people's motivations and predict market trends. So he noticed immediately when Kayla's inhaler ran low. She was careful about it, discreet in the way she checked the device. But Nicholas had grown accustomed to the small rituals of her daily life, despite his efforts to remain detached. He noticed how she always carried the inhaler in her right pocket, how she would sometimes pause and take a small preventative puff before climbing stairs or when the apartment's air conditioning was running high. He also noticed when she began to ration her usage, taking smaller puffs and checking the device more frequently. Without allowing himself to examine his motivations too closely, Nicholas researched her prescription during a break between meetings. A few discreet phone calls established her medication type and dosage, and a conversation with a medical supply company arranged for a significant supply to be delivered to his office. The inhalers arrived on a Tuesday, packaged discreetly in a plain medical supply box. Nicholas brought them home that evening, feeling oddly nervous about his plan. If Kayla discovered what he was doing, she might ask questions he wasn't prepared to answer. He wasn't entirely sure he could explain his actions to himself, let alone to her. But the thought of another emergency, of her collapsing while he was at work or unable to help, was unacceptable. This was simple risk management, he told himself. Practical preparation for a predictable medical need. Nicholas waited until he heard Kayla's shower running before beginning his covert mission. He placed inhalers in strategic locations throughout the apartment, one in the kitchen drawer nearest the stove, one in the living room side table, another in the hallway closet. He saved one for her studio, slipping it into the small storage cabinet beside her desk when he was certain she was occupied in another part of the apartment. The task felt strangely intimate, this secret act of care for someone who was essentially a stranger. Nicholas found himself hoping she would discover the inhalers gradually, naturally, without connecting them directly to him. He wanted her to be safe, but he didn't want to explain why her safety mattered to him. 3 days later, he heard a small gasp of surprise from Kayla's studio. Nicholas paused in his work, listening as she opened and closed cabinet doors, clearly searching for something. Then came the sound of her discovering the inhaler he'd hidden there, a soft "oh" of recognition and what might have been relief. She didn't mention the discovery to him, just as he'd hoped. But that evening, when she left dinner on the table again, Nicholas noticed she'd prepared his favorite wine pairing without him ever having mentioned his preference. Small gestures, meeting small gestures, both of them pretending not to notice what they were doing for each other. Over the following days, Nicholas became attuned to the subtle signs that Kayla was finding the other inhalers. Her shoulders seemed less tense, her breathing more relaxed when she moved through the apartment. She no longer rationed her medication, and the small worry line that had appeared between her eyebrows disappeared. Nicholas told himself he was satisfied with the practical success of his intervention. He was ensuring the health and safety of someone living in his home, a logical precaution that any responsible person would take. The fact that her obvious relief brought him an unexpected sense of satisfaction was irrelevant. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and he should have been focusing on quarterly reports, Nicholas found himself listening for the sound of Kayla's breathing from her room down the hall. Just to be sure she was sleeping peacefully. Just to be certain she was safe. It was practical concern, nothing more. He was protecting his investment in this arrangement, ensuring that nothing went wrong during their 2-year contract. The alternative, that he might actually care about Kayla Johnson beyond her utility in his father's business plans, was too complicated to contemplate. So Nicholas buried himself deeper in his work, maintained his emotional distance, and told himself that the small acts of care were simply good household management. But sometimes, when he heard Kayla's quiet laughter drifting from her studio, or caught a glimpse of her photographing the sunrise from their balcony, he wondered if he was lying to himself about more than just the inhalers. The apartment was beginning to feel different with her in it, warmer somehow, despite his efforts to maintain the same sterile environment he'd cultivated for 2 years. Kayla brought life to spaces that had been merely functional, and her presence was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. But Nicholas was a master of emotional compartmentalization. He'd learned to shut down feelings that threatened his control, to focus on what was practical and safe rather than what might be beautiful or meaningful. This arrangement was temporary, beneficial, and bounded by clear rules. Whatever else it might become was irrelevant. Even if, sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, he found himself hoping that Kayla might stay in his life long past the 2-year expiration date of their contract. 2 months into their marriage, Kayla had established her own evening routine. After Nicholas disappeared into his office following dinner, she would settle into the living room's plush sectional sofa with a cup of tea and lose herself in her favorite television series. Hearts and Heirs was her guilty pleasure, a lavish period drama about arranged marriages among nobility that somehow always ended in true love despite impossible odds. She was completely absorbed in an episode where the brooding Duke of Ravenshallow was reluctantly beginning to soften toward his spirited arranged bride when she heard the familiar sound of Nicholas's wheelchair in the hallway. Usually, he moved directly from his office to his bedroom without pause, but tonight the sound stopped. Kayla glanced over to find Nicholas in the living room doorway, his expression skeptical as he observed the romantic drama playing out on the large television screen. "Unrealistic," he said flatly, his first unsolicited comment to her in weeks. "Excuse me?" Kayla paused the show, surprised by his sudden engagement. "The premise," Nicholas gestured toward the screen where the Duke and his bride were frozen in a moment of heated argument. No one falls in love through an arranged marriage in 3 months. People don't change their fundamental nature because someone looks at them with hopeful eyes. Despite his dismissive tone, Kayla felt a flutter of excitement at having an actual conversation with her husband. "You'd be surprised what people are capable of when they let their walls down," she replied, matching his matter-of-fact tone with playful challenge. Nicholas's eyebrows rose slightly. Walls exist for good reasons, usually because someone has learned that hope leads to disappointment. And sometimes, Kayla countered, walls become prisons that keep out the very things we need most. They stared at each other for a moment, the conversation suddenly feeling less theoretical than either of them had intended. Nicholas's jaw tightened, and Kayla wondered if she'd pushed too far. "Enjoy your fantasy," he said curtly, wheeling away toward his bedroom. But as Kayla resumed the episode, she couldn't shake the feeling that Nicholas had lingered in that doorway longer than necessary, and that his criticism of the show's premise had carried the weight of personal experience. The following evening, Kayla was settled in her usual spot for the next episode when she heard Nicholas's wheelchair approaching again. This time, instead of stopping in the doorway, he wheeled directly into the living room and positioned himself at the far end of the sectional sofa. "Don't mind me," he said, pulling out his tablet. "I have reports to review." Kayla tried to hide her smile as she started the episode. Nicholas made a show of focusing on his work, but she noticed his eyes drifting to the screen whenever he thought she wasn't looking. "Oh, come on," Nicholas muttered during a particularly dramatic scene where the Duke dramatically declared his growing feelings. "No man talks like that." "Maybe the men you know don't," Kayla replied without taking her eyes off the screen. "Some people are comfortable expressing emotion. Some people confuse melodrama with genuine feeling." Despite his criticism, Nicholas didn't leave. As the episode progressed, his commentary became more frequent and, surprisingly, more engaged. He questioned plot points, criticized character motivations, and pointed out historical inaccuracies with the enthusiasm of someone who was genuinely invested in the story. "The Duchess would never wear that gown to a morning visit," he observed during a scene between two female characters. "The neckline is entirely inappropriate for the time period." Kayla turned to stare at him. "How do you know anything about period-appropriate necklines?" Nicholas's cheeks flushed slightly. "I read history for business purposes." "Business purposes," Kayla repeated, not bothering to hide her amusement. "Historical understanding informs investment decisions in antiques and art," Nicholas said stiffly, but Kayla caught the defensive note in his voice. "Of course it does," she agreed solemnly, then burst into laughter when a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, despite his efforts to maintain his serious expression. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, a low, rusty sound that suggested he was out of practice, but not entirely unwilling to rediscover the skill. "The writing is terrible," Nicholas declared as the episode ended, but he made no move to leave. "Absolutely awful," Kayla agreed cheerfully. "Same time tomorrow?" Nicholas hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to maintain distance and his obvious curiosity about what would happen next in the story. "I might have more reports to review," he said finally. "Of course," Kayla said. "I'll be here if you need somewhere quiet to work." By the third movie night, Nicholas had abandoned all pretense of working during the show. He arrived in the living room promptly at 8 o'clock, positioning his wheelchair in what had apparently become his designated spot, and waited for Kayla to start the episode. "The Duke is making a mistake, trusting his cousin," Nicholas announced before the opening credits had finished. Kayla paused the show and turned to stare at him. "How could you possibly know that? This is only episode 12. Nicholas's expression grew carefully neutral. "It's obvious from the character development patterns." "Nicholas," Kayla said slowly, a delighted grin spreading across her face. "Have you been watching ahead?" "I may have reviewed a few episodes," he admitted reluctantly. "For analytical purposes." "Analytical purposes," Kayla repeated, her grin widening. How many episodes? Through episode 22. Nicholas, that's the entire season. The plotting is predictable once you understand the formula, he said defensively, but his cheeks were pink with embarrassment. Kayla dissolved into laughter, and after a moment, Nicholas joined her. The sound of their shared amusement filled the usually quiet apartment, and for the first time since their wedding, the space felt truly lived in rather than merely occupied. So, what happens? Kayla demanded. Do they end up together? Does she choose him or the stable boy? I'm not going to spoil it for you, Nicholas said primly. That would ruin the viewing experience. You're terrible, Kayla accused, but she was still smiling. Here I thought you were this serious businessman who only cared about profit margins, and you're secretly binge-watching period romances. I was researching the genre, Nicholas protested weakly. For business purposes? For anthropological interest. You're a closet romantic, Nicholas Anderson. The words hung in the air between them, and Nicholas's expression grew suddenly guarded. Kayla realized she'd touched on something deeper than his television viewing habits, something that connected to whatever had made him so determined to keep the world at arm's length. I'm a realist, Nicholas said quietly. The show is fantasy. Real life doesn't work that way. How do you know? Kayla asked gently. Have you ever tried letting someone close enough to find out? Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers gripping the arms of his wheelchair. Once, he said finally. It didn't end well. Kayla wanted to ask more, to understand what had hurt him so deeply that he'd built walls this high. But something in his expression warned her not to push, not yet. Well, she said lightly, maybe we should see how it works out for the Duke before we make any final judgments about real life. Nicholas nodded, seeming grateful for the reprieve. As Kayla started the episode, she noticed that he'd relaxed again, his shoulders less tense than they'd been moments before. And when the Duke and his bride shared their first tentative kiss at the episode's end, Kayla pretended not to notice the way Nicholas's breath caught, or how his hand moved unconsciously toward his heart. 3 weeks later, on a particularly warm spring afternoon, Kayla was photographing the apartment building's rooftop garden when she realized she'd forgotten her inhaler. She'd been so focused on capturing the perfect shot of the city skyline framed by flowering vines that she'd left her studio without her usual careful check of pockets and supplies. The oversight didn't seem important at first. The day was beautiful, her breathing was fine, and she was only planning to spend an hour outdoors. But as she crouched and stretched to get various angles, adjusting her position repeatedly to find the ideal composition, she began to feel the familiar tightness in her chest. Kayla paused, pressing her hand to her chest as her breathing became more labored. The spring air carried pollen and city dust, and the combination of physical exertion and environmental triggers was creating the perfect storm for an asthma attack. She needed to get back to the apartment immediately. But as she tried to stand, her legs felt weak and unsteady. The tightness in her chest was becoming genuine difficulty breathing, each inhale requiring conscious effort. Panic began to set in as she realized how serious this attack was becoming. Help, she tried to call, but the word came out as barely a whisper. The rooftop garden was deserted, and even if someone had been nearby, she wouldn't have been able to make herself heard. Kayla managed to take a few steps toward the building's entrance before her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the brick pathway, her camera equipment scattering around her as she struggled to draw breath into lungs that felt like they were closing down entirely. This was bad, worse than any attack she'd had since childhood. She needed her inhaler, needed it now, but it might as well have been on the moon for all her ability to reach it. As her vision began to blur at the edges, Kayla heard the sound of the rooftop door opening. Through her panic, she recognized the familiar mechanical whir of Nicholas's wheelchair. "Kayla!" His voice cut through her growing disorientation, sharp with alarm. "What's wrong?" She tried to answer, but no sound emerged, except the harsh wheeze of her struggling respiratory system. Nicholas took in the scene instantly. Kayla collapsed on the ground, her face pale and lips beginning to take on a bluish tinge, the scattered photography equipment that told the story of her sudden collapse. "Asthma attack," he said, more to himself than to her, his mind immediately shifting into crisis management mode. "Where's your inhaler?" Kayla's eyes met his, wide with panic and the desperate communication of someone who couldn't speak. He understood immediately. She didn't have it with her. "In your studio," he asked urgently. She managed the smallest nod, and Nicholas was already moving, wheeling toward the building entrance with more speed than he'd ever attempted in his chair. The elevator ride down to their floor felt endless, every second stretching as he imagined Kayla alone on the rooftop, fighting for breath. He burst into the apartment and raced toward her studio, his hands shaking as he yanked open desk drawers and cabinet doors, searching for the spare inhaler he'd hidden there months ago. There, in the storage cabinet beside her computer, exactly where he'd placed it. Nicholas grabbed the inhaler and spun his wheelchair toward the door, but in his haste, he took the corner too sharply. The chair tilted, balance shifting, and suddenly he was falling sideways onto the studio floor, the inhaler skittering across the hardwood. For a moment, he lay there stunned, his legs twisted awkwardly beneath him. Then the image of Kayla's desperate face flooded back, and panic overrode everything else. She was dying up there while he was trapped on the floor like a useless. No, Nicholas refused to accept helplessness. Not now, not when Kayla needed him. He rolled onto his stomach and began pulling himself toward the inhaler with his arms. But it was too slow, too inefficient. Kayla didn't have time for him to crawl across the floor. Without conscious thought, Nicholas planted his hands firmly on the ground and pushed himself up onto his knees. The sensation of his legs supporting weight was strange, almost forgotten, but there was no time to marvel at it. He needed to stand. He needed to walk. Nicholas gripped the edge of Kayla's desk and hauled himself upright, his legs trembling with the unfamiliar effort but holding his weight. One step toward the inhaler, then another. His gait was unsteady, his muscles weak from 2 years of disuse, but his legs were working. He grabbed the inhaler and took 3 more steps back to his wheelchair, collapsing into it with relief and amazement that he didn't have time to process. Later, he would think about what had just happened. Right now, he had to save Kayla. When Nicholas reached the rooftop, he found Kayla exactly where he'd left her, but her condition had worsened. Her breathing was now completely labored, coming in desperate gasps that barely seemed to bring in any air. "I've got it," he said, lifting her into a sitting position and pressing the inhaler into her hands. "Kayla, look at me. You know what to do." She managed to bring the inhaler to her lips with shaking hands, and Nicholas helped guide it, making sure she created a proper seal. "Breathe in slowly," he instructed, his voice calm despite his inner panic. "Hold it. Good." They repeated the process twice more before Kayla's breathing began to ease. Color started returning to her face, and the terrifying wheeze that had accompanied each breath began to fade. "Better?" Nicholas asked, still supporting her as she leaned against his wheelchair. Kayla nodded, not yet trusting her voice, but her eyes were clear again, focused on his face with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Nicholas," she said finally, her voice still hoarse but stronger. "You leg. It twitched. It moved just a few seconds ago." The words hit him like cold water. In the crisis, he'd completely forgotten about his impossible dash across her studio floor. Now, with Kayla safe and breathing normally, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. "No," he said quickly, his expression shuddering. "You must have been confused, not getting enough oxygen." "I saw it," Kayla insisted gently. "Your right leg moved. It tilted a bit just as you were about to hand the inhaler to me." "You were hallucinating," Nicholas said firmly, but his hands were shaking as he adjusted the position of his wheelchair. Oxygen deprivation can cause visual disturbances. Kayla studied his face, clearly weighing whether to push the issue. Something in his expression must have warned her off, because she simply nodded. "Thank you," she said instead, "for saving me." Nicholas looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude and terrified by the implications of what had actually happened in her studio. "We should get you inside. You need to rest." As he helped her to her feet and gathered her scattered photography equipment, Nicholas's mind was racing. He had actually walked, with purpose and coordination, when someone needed him desperately enough. Which meant Dr. Chen had been right all along. His paralysis was psychological, not physical. His legs worked perfectly fine when his conscious mind wasn't busy convincing them they couldn't. That night, after Kayla had gone to bed, Nicholas sat alone in his office and stared at his phone for an hour before finally dialing Dr. Chen's number. "Nicholas?" Her voice was surprised but pleased. "It's been months since our last session. I'd like to schedule an appointment," he said quietly. "As soon as possible." "Of course. May I ask what's changed?" Nicholas looked toward his office door, thinking of Kayla sleeping down the hall, the woman who had somehow, in the space of a medical emergency, given him back the use of his legs. "I think," he said carefully, "I might be ready to try walking again." Nicholas had been attending therapy sessions for 3 weeks before Kayla discovered his secret. She found the appointment cards purely by accident. They fell out of his jacket pocket when she was taking his dry cleaning to the closet, scattered across the bedroom floor, like evidence of a hidden life. "Physical Therapy, Dr. Sarah Chen," was printed neatly on each card, with dates and times spanning the past month. Kayla stared at the cards for a long moment, remembering the day of her asthma attack, and Nicholas's vehement denial that he'd walked. She'd known he was lying, but she'd respected his need to keep that miracle private. Now, seeing proof that he was actively working to reclaim the use of his legs, she felt a rush of pride and hope that surprised her with its intensity. She was carefully placing the cards back in his jacket pocket when Nicholas wheeled into the bedroom. "I found these on the floor," Kayla said, holding up one of the appointment cards. "They must have fallen out when I was hanging up your jacket." Nicholas's expression went carefully blank, the same shuttered look he wore whenever personal topics arose. "I see." "Nicholas," Kayla said gently, "this is wonderful. You're working with a physical therapist." "It's simply physical maintenance," he said stiffly, "preventing muscle deterioration." "Is it working?" Kayla asked, ignoring his deflection. "Are you making progress?" Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his wheelchair's armrest in the pattern she'd learned meant he was wrestling with internal conflict. "Some," he admitted finally. "That's amazing." Kayla's smile was radiant, and Nicholas felt something tight in his chest loosen at her obvious joy in his progress. "The appointments are across town," he said abruptly. "The scheduling can be difficult with work commitments." Kayla tilted her head, studying his face. "Would it help if I drove you? I don't have any shoots scheduled on Tuesdays and Thursdays." The offer hung in the air between them. It was such a simple thing, transportation to medical appointments, but they both understood it represented something larger. Kayla was asking to become part of his healing process, to share in this intensely private journey he'd been taking alone. "You don't need to do that," Nicholas said, but his tone lacked conviction. "I know I don't need to," Kayla replied. "I want to." The first time Kayla drove Nicholas to therapy, she waited in the car, reading a photography magazine and trying not to think about what was happening inside the medical building. But when he emerged an hour later, clearly exhausted and emotionally drained, she found herself studying his face with concern that went beyond mere politeness. "How did it go?" she asked as he transferred himself into the passenger seat. "Fine," Nicholas replied, but his voice was tight with frustration. The second week, Kayla suggested waiting in the building lobby. "There's better light for reading," she explained casually, "and the parking meters out here are unpredictable." Nicholas didn't argue, and Kayla spent the session in a comfortable chair near the reception desk, close enough to provide moral support but far enough away to respect his privacy. By the fourth week, she had graduated to the actual waiting room outside Dr. Chen's office. Other patients and family members nodded to her in the universal acknowledgement of shared waiting room territory, and Kayla began to feel like she was truly part of Nicholas's healing journey. "Mrs. Anderson?" Dr. Chen appeared in the waiting room doorway after one particularly long session, her expression curious and pleased. "Your husband mentioned you've been driving him to appointments. Would you like to join us for the last few minutes today?" Kayla looked at Nicholas, who was seated in his wheelchair beside the doctor, his face unreadable. After a moment, he gave the smallest nod. The therapy room was bright and equipped with various walking aids and exercise equipment. Nicholas looked small and vulnerable among the professional apparatus, but Kayla could see the determination in his shoulders, the way he held himself like someone who was fighting for something important. "Nicholas has made remarkable progress," Dr. Chen explained, consulting her notes. "His strength and coordination have improved significantly over the past month." "That's wonderful," Kayla said, looking at Nicholas with genuine pride. "The biggest hurdle now is psychological," Dr. Chen continued. "Nicholas needs to trust his body again, to believe that his legs will support him when it matters." Kayla thought about the day of her asthma attack. He already had that trust, she realized. He just didn't know it yet. The drive home from therapy sessions became a time of unexpected intimacy. Confined in the car together, with Nicholas relaxed from the physical exertion and Kayla focused on navigating traffic, conversations began to flow more naturally than they ever had in the apartment. "What made you want to become a photographer?" Nicholas asked one afternoon, the question emerging from comfortable silence. Kayla glanced at him, surprised by his curiosity. "My father," she said finally. "He gave me my first camera when I was 8. Said the world was full of beautiful moments that most people miss because they're too busy looking ahead or behind instead of right where they are." "Wise man." "Yeah," she said, and then continued. "It's why I'm completely hooked on capturing those moments he talked about. Even in the worst situations, there's usually something beautiful if you know how to look for it." Nicholas was quiet, processing this insight into her worldview. "Is that why you see good in everyone, even people who don't deserve it?" The question was clearly personal, and Kayla felt the weight of his guarded trust in asking it. "I think most people are doing the best they can with what they've been given," she said carefully. "Sometimes the people who seem the most difficult are just the most hurt, and sometimes people are exactly as selfish and destructive as they appear to be." There was pain in Nicholas's voice, old hurt that had clearly shaped his defensive approach to the world. Kayla wanted to ask what had happened to him, who had hurt him so badly that he'd built walls this high, but she sensed he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. "Maybe," she conceded, "but I'd rather risk being wrong about someone's capacity for good than miss the chance to connect with someone who just needs to be seen clearly." Nicholas turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "That's a dangerous way to live." "So is assuming everyone will hurt you," Kayla replied gently. They were both quiet for the rest of the drive, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence that had characterized their early interactions. This felt more like two people considering new possibilities, testing the boundaries of trust that had begun to grow between them. That evening, Nicholas joined Kayla for Hearts and Airs, without being asked, settling into his usual spot on the sectional as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And when the Duke finally told his arranged bride that he was beginning to care for her, Nicholas didn't make a single sarcastic comment about unrealistic romantic development. Instead, he glanced at Kayla with an expression she couldn't quite read, and for a moment, she wondered if they were both thinking about the same thing, how fiction sometimes had a way of revealing truths that real life kept hidden. The evening started like any other movie night, but something felt different from the moment Nicholas wheeled into the living room. Perhaps it was the way the setting sun cast golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows, or maybe it was simply that 5 months of shared evenings had created an intimacy neither of them had intended. "No episode tonight," Kayla announced as Nicholas settled into his usual spot. "The season finale aired last week." "Ah," Nicholas looked genuinely disappointed. "What happens now?" Do we find another period drama to dissect? We could, Kayla said, tucking her legs beneath her on the couch. Or we could just talk. The suggestion hung in the air between them, more loaded than it should have been. Their conversations had grown deeper over the past weeks, but they'd always had the safety net of the television show to return to when things became too personal. What would you like to talk about? Nicholas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Tell me about before, Kayla said impulsively. Before the accident. What were you like when you weren't so determined to keep the world at arm's length? Nicholas's expression grew guarded, but he didn't immediately deflect the question, as he once would have. Different, he said finally. I used to believe in possibilities. I thought if you worked hard enough, wanted something badly enough, you could make it happen. What changed that? Nicholas was quiet for so long that Kayla thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was going to propose, he said, to Charlotte. We'd been together for 4 years, living together for 2. I had this elaborate plan, dinner at the restaurant where we first met, a string quartet, the ring I'd spent months choosing. His laugh was bitter. I came home early to pick up the ring, and I found her in our bed with my business partner. Kayla's heart clenched at the raw pain in his voice. Nicholas, I'm so sorry. The stupid part is, I wasn't even angry at first. I was confused. I kept thinking there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding. Nicholas stared out the window at the city lights. But there wasn't. She'd been seeing him for 8 months. Apparently, I was too predictable, too safe. She wanted excitement. So you drove off into a storm. So I drove off into a storm, Nicholas confirmed, and woke up a month later unable to walk, which seemed like perfect justice at the time. I'd lost everything that mattered anyway. Kayla wanted to reach for him, to offer physical comfort for the pain he was sharing. But something in his posture warned her to stay still. What about you? Nicholas asked, clearly needing to shift the focus away from his own wounds. What dreams are you chasing with that camera of yours? I want to open my own gallery someday, Kayla admitted. Not just to display my work, but to showcase other photographers who see beauty in unexpected places. People who tell stories that matter. That sounds incredible. Why haven't you done it? Kayla shrugged. Money, mostly. And fear, I suppose. It's safer to keep it as a dream than to risk failure by actually trying. Fear is a terrible reason not to pursue something that matters to you. Says the man who spent 2 years refusing to try walking again, Kayla teased gently. Nicholas smiled, a real smile, not the carefully controlled expressions he usually wore. Point taken. We're both cowards, apparently. Reformed cowards, Kayla corrected. You're walking again. I'm building my portfolio. Maybe we're braver than we thought. Maybe we are. They were sitting closer now, though neither could say exactly when that had happened. The conversation had drawn them together like gravity, and suddenly Kayla was acutely aware of the way Nicholas was looking at her, not with his usual careful distance, but with something that looked dangerously like longing. Kayla, he said softly, and her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before. Yes? Nicholas leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching her face. I think I'm... The sound of a car backfiring in the street below shattered the moment like glass. Both of them startled, pulling back as if waking from a spell, suddenly aware of how close they'd been to crossing a line that would change everything. I should... Nicholas cleared his throat, his professional mask sliding back into place. It's late. I have an early meeting tomorrow. Of course, Kayla said quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and disappointment. I should get some rest too. They said their goodnights with careful politeness, both of them working hard to pretend that nothing significant had almost happened. But as Kayla lay awake in her bed an hour later, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of their conversation, she couldn't shake the memory of how Nicholas had looked at her in that perfect, interrupted moment. Down the hall, Nicholas was having the same sleepless night, his mind churning with the realization that somewhere in the past 5 months, his contractual wife had become someone he was falling in love with, and that terrified him more than his accident ever had. The next morning brought an atmosphere of studied politeness that felt more strained than their original cold distance. Nicholas left for work earlier than usual, and when he returned that evening, he went directly to his office without stopping for their usual brief kitchen encounter. Kayla threw herself into her photography work with desperate intensity, editing photos and reaching out to potential clients with the kind of manic energy that comes from trying not to think about something important. She cooked dinner as always, but when Nicholas didn't emerge from his office, she ate alone and put his portion in the refrigerator without the usual hopeful presentation on the dining room table. Maybe this is better, Kayla told herself as she cleaned up the kitchen. We were getting too close, too comfortable. This is supposed to be a business arrangement. 2 years, and then we go our separate ways. Getting emotionally involved would just complicate everything. But even as she rationalized their return to distance, she found herself listening for the sound of his wheelchair in the hallway, hoping he might emerge for one of their movie nights or casual conversations. When he didn't, the disappointment felt disproportionate to what their relationship was supposed to be. Meanwhile, Nicholas sat in his office pretending to review quarterly reports while actually staring at the same spreadsheet for 45 minutes. His mind kept drifting to the way Kayla had looked in the golden evening light, the way her eyes had softened when he'd shared the story of Charlotte's betrayal, the moment when he'd almost kissed her and she hadn't pulled away. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid, he thought, forcing himself to focus on profit margins and investment strategies. Emotional attachment leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability leads to pain. Charlotte proved that. This arrangement with Kayla is temporary and beneficial to both parties. Getting feelings involved would be a mistake. But when he wheeled past her studio on his way to bed and saw the light still on, heard the soft sound of her moving around inside, he had to grip his wheelchair handles to keep from knocking on her door. They were both falling, and they were both fighting it with everything they had. Despite their best efforts to maintain distance, proximity and routine conspired against them. Living in the same space, sharing meals and daily rhythms, made it impossible to completely avoid each other. 3 days after the almost kiss, Kayla was reaching for a coffee mug in the kitchen when Nicholas wheeled in to get his morning water. The space was too small for them to avoid each other entirely, and when Kayla stepped back from the cabinet, she accidentally bumped into his wheelchair. "Sorry," she said quickly, steadying herself with a hand on his shoulder. The contact lasted only a second, but Nicholas felt it like an electric shock. Her hand was warm through his shirt, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. "No problem," he managed, but his voice came out rougher than intended. Kayla's hand lingered for just a beat longer than necessary before she pulled away, and when their eyes met, the careful politeness they'd been maintaining cracked slightly. "I made extra coffee," she said softly. "If you want some." "Thank you," Nicholas replied, and they both knew they weren't just talking about coffee anymore. Similar moments began to accumulate over the following days. Accidental touches when passing documents or salt shakers, lingering eye contact during brief conversations. The way Nicholas would pause outside Kayla's studio, as if gathering the courage to knock, before continuing to his own room. The way Kayla would find excuses to walk past his office when the door was open, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Nicholas found himself memorizing details about her that he had no business noticing, the way she hummed softly while editing photos, how she always tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was concentrating, the specific quality of light that made her smile when she was looking through her camera lens. His heart had started doing irregular things when she was near, racing at unexpected moments and making him feel like a teenager with his first crush. It was ridiculous and unprofessional, and exactly what he'd promised himself he wouldn't let happen. Kayla was having her own battle with unwanted feelings. She caught herself listening for the sound of Nicholas's return from work each evening, timing her activities to coincide with his movements through the apartment. She'd started leaving her studio door open while she worked, telling herself it was for better air circulation while knowing it was really because she hoped he might stop by. When he laughed at something during their now sporadic movie nights, she felt unreasonably proud to have caused that reaction. When he shared small details about his day or his therapy progress, she treasured those moments of trust like precious gifts. They were both losing the fight against their growing feelings, but neither was ready to admit defeat. "Kayla, you need to see this." Grace Hamilton's voice was breathless with excitement over the phone. The Times just published a review of the Meridian Gallery's new showing, and they specifically mentioned your photograph. Kayla nearly dropped her camera, which she'd been cleaning in preparation for an upcoming wedding shoot. "They what?" "Particularly striking is an untitled piece by K. Johnson," Grace read aloud, "a sunrise photograph that captures both the grandeur of urban architecture and the intimate beauty of morning light. The artist demonstrates a remarkable ability to find profound beauty in everyday moments." Kayla sank into her studio chair, overwhelmed. 3 months ago, she'd submitted a portfolio to the Meridian Gallery on a whim, never expecting to hear back. When they'd selected one of her sunrise photographs for their group exhibition of emerging photographers, she'd been thrilled but tried not to get her hopes up too high. This kind of professional recognition had been a dream for so long that having it actually happen felt surreal. "This is incredible," she whispered. "This could change everything." "It already is," Grace said warmly. "Mrs. Patterson from the country club called this morning. She saw the review and wants to commission you for her daughter's engagement party. And apparently, the Riverside Museum is interested in discussing a possible solo show." After hanging up with Grace, Kayla sat in her studio, staring at the framed photograph that had garnered such praise. It was one of the sunrise shots she'd taken from the apartment balcony months ago, during those early days when capturing beautiful moments had been her way of coping with the loneliness of her arranged marriage. The irony wasn't lost on her. This photograph, created during one of the most isolated periods of her life, was now opening doors to the career she'd always dreamed of. "Kayla!" Nicholas's voice from the studio doorway startled her out of her thoughts. "Nicholas, hi." She turned to find him studying the newspaper clipping Grace had read to her over the phone, which she'd printed from the online version. "I saw this in my news alerts," he said, and Kayla realized he must have set up notifications for her name. The thought that he'd been quietly following her career made something warm unfurl in her chest. "You have news alerts for me?" Nicholas's cheeks reddened slightly. "I like to stay informed about household matters." "Household matters," Kayla repeated, fighting a smile. "This is significant recognition," Nicholas continued, his voice taking on the professional tone he used when he was trying to hide emotion. "The Meridian Gallery is highly respected. Having your work featured there will open important doors." "I hope so," Kayla said softly. "I've been dreaming of this kind of opportunity for years." Nicholas wheeled closer to examine the sunrise photograph hanging on her studio wall. He studied it with the same intensity he brought to business reports, and Kayla found herself holding her breath, waiting for his assessment. "It's extraordinary," he said finally, and the genuine admiration in his voice made her heart skip. "You've captured something that most people would see as ordinary and revealed its inherent beauty. That's a rare gift." "Thank you," Kayla whispered, overwhelmed by the praise from someone whose opinion had come to matter far more than it should have. "You should celebrate," Nicholas said suddenly. "This kind of achievement deserves recognition." "I was thinking of making a nice dinner," Kayla replied. "Maybe opening one of those expensive bottles of wine you have in the kitchen." "We should go out," Nicholas said impulsively, then seemed surprised by his own suggestion. "I mean, if you'd like to. There's a restaurant downtown that has excellent food and they're accommodating." The invitation hung in the air between them, clearly more than just a friendly gesture. This would be their first public appearance together as a couple, their first time sharing a meal outside the safe boundaries of the apartment. "I'd love that," Kayla said softly, and when Nicholas smiled, a real, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face, she felt herself falling a little deeper into feelings she was supposed to be fighting. 2 weeks later, Kayla watched from the therapy room waiting area as Nicholas took 15 consecutive steps across the parallel bars, his face set with determination and something that looked like wonder. "Excellent," Dr. Chen praised, making notes on her tablet. "Your strength and coordination have improved dramatically over the past month." Nicholas gripped the parallel bars, breathing hard from the exertion but clearly exhilarated by his progress. When he looked toward the waiting area and saw Kayla watching through the glass partition, his face lit up with a pride that made her heart ache with affection. After the session, Nicholas was quieter than usual during the drive home, but it was a thoughtful silence rather than the brooding withdrawal she'd learned to recognize. "You were amazing in there," Kayla said finally, unable to contain her enthusiasm any longer. 15 steps, Nicholas. That's incredible progress." It felt. Nicholas paused, searching for words. It felt like remembering something I'd forgotten I knew how to do, like muscle memory that had been sleeping. "Dr. Chen thinks you'll be walking unassisted within a few weeks." "Maybe," Nicholas said carefully, but Kayla could see the hope he was trying to contain. "I don't want to expect too much too quickly." "Why not?" Kayla asked. "You've worked so hard for this. You deserve to be excited about getting your mobility back." Nicholas was quiet for several blocks. "Because," he said finally, "the last time I let myself hope for something, really hope, it was taken away in the most devastating way possible. I'm not sure I can survive that kind of disappointment again." Kayla felt her heart break a little for the pain in his voice. Without thinking, she reached over and covered his hand with hers. "This is different," she said firmly. "This isn't about other people or circumstances beyond your control. This is about your body, your determination, your healing. No one can take that away from you." Nicholas stared down at their joined hands, and for a moment, Kayla thought he might pull away. Instead, he turned his palm up and laced their fingers together. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing in me even when I couldn't believe in myself." "Always," Kayla replied, and meant it with an intensity that scared her. They drove the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, hands still linked, both of them acutely aware that they'd crossed another invisible line in their carefully maintained boundaries. But neither pulled away, and when Nicholas squeezed her hand gently as they pulled into their building's parking garage, Kayla felt something settle into place in her chest, something that felt dangerously like love taking root. That evening, Nicholas joined her for dinner at the actual dining room table instead of disappearing into his office. They talked about her upcoming gallery opportunities and his therapy progress, sharing hopes and plans as if they had a future together beyond their 2-year contract. And when Nicholas reached across the table to refill her wine glass, his fingers brushing against hers in the process, neither of them pretended it was accidental. The careful distance they'd maintained for months was crumbling, replaced by something warmer and infinitely more dangerous. They were falling in love, and they were finally starting to let themselves fall. 8 months into their marriage, on a quiet Sunday morning in early spring, Kayla was reviewing proofs from her latest gallery submission when she heard an unusual sound from the living room. It wasn't the familiar mechanical whir of Nicholas's wheelchair, but rather the soft shuffle of footsteps on hardwood. Curious, she set down her camera and padded barefoot toward the living room, expecting to find Nicholas had knocked something over, or perhaps that someone had entered the apartment. What she found instead stopped her in her tracks. Nicholas stood in the center of the living room, no wheelchair in sight, his hands resting lightly on the back of the sofa for balance. As she watched, frozen in amazement, he took a careful step forward, then another, his movements deliberate but increasingly confident. "Nicholas," she breathed, and he looked up at the sound of her voice. His face was radiant with a mixture of pride, wonder, and nervous excitement. "I wanted to surprise you," he said, taking another step in her direction. Dr. Chen cleared me for unassisted walking yesterday, but I wanted to practice before. He took 3 more steps, and suddenly he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You're walking," Kayla whispered, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Nicholas, you're really walking." "I'm walking," he confirmed, his voice filled with amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. Without thinking, Kayla launched herself into his arms, her joy and excitement overriding any concern about his still recovering balance. But Nicholas caught her easily, his arms strong and sure around her waist, spinning her in a small circle as they both laughed with pure happiness. When he set her down, they were standing impossibly close, her hands resting on his chest, his arms still encircling her waist. The laughter faded as they became acutely aware of their proximity, of the way this moment felt different from every interaction they'd shared before. "Kayla," Nicholas said softly, his eyes searching her face. "Yes? I need to tell you something." But before he could speak, Kayla rose up on her toes and kissed him, pouring 8 months of growing affection and carefully contained feelings into the contact. For a heartbeat, Nicholas stood frozen with surprise. Then his arms tightened around her, and he kissed her back with an intensity that spoke of his own months of denied longing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nicholas rested his forehead against hers. "That wasn't what I planned to say," he murmured, but he was smiling. "What were you going to say?" Kayla asked, her hands still fisted in his shirt. Nicholas pulled back slightly, his expression growing serious. "That I love you?" he said simply. "I'm completely, irrevocably in love with you, and I don't care anymore that this was supposed to be a business arrangement." Kayla's breath caught. "Nicholas, I know this complicates everything," he continued, the words tumbling out as if he'd been holding them back for too long. "I know we agreed this was temporary, that we'd both walk away after 2 years, but I can't pretend anymore that you're just a convenient wife or that what I feel for you is anything less than real." "What about the arrangement?" Kayla asked, though her heart was soaring. "What about your father's expectations, the company succession?" "I don't care," Nicholas said fiercely. "The board approved my promotion last month. The company is secure, and even if it wasn't, Kayla, I would choose you over any business deal, any expectation, any obligation. I want to be married to you because I love you, not because a contract says we have to be." Kayla searched his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the way he was offering her his heart, despite everything that had hurt him before. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been fighting it for months, telling myself it was temporary, that I shouldn't get attached. But Nicholas, I love you so much it scares me." "Don't be scared," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "We're good at this, at taking care of each other, at building something real together. Stay with me. Not because of any contract or arrangement, but because you want to." "Yes," Kayla said against his lips as he leaned down to kiss her again. "Yes, I want to stay. I want to build a real life with you." This kiss was different from the first. Deeper, more certain, filled with the promise of a future they were choosing together, rather than one that had been imposed upon them. When they finally separated, both were smiling through tears of happiness. "So," Nicholas said, still holding her close, "I suppose we should probably have a real wedding at some point. One where we both mean the vows we're saying." "I'd like that," Kayla laughed. "There's something I need to tell you," Kayla said quickly, recognizing the shift in Nicholas's tone. They were still standing in the middle of the living room, his arms around her waist, but suddenly the air felt charged with nervous energy. "Actually," Nicholas said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you first." He guided her to the sofa, and they sat facing each other, hands linked but both clearly steeling themselves for a difficult conversation. "A few weeks ago," Nicholas began, "I was researching potential investment opportunities in educational facilities. I stumbled upon a random graduation picture of a young lady standing next to your parents, the Hamiltons." He paused, meeting her eyes. Kayla's heart stopped. The caption on the photo insinuated that she was the daughter of Hamilton Industries CEO. Nicholas continued. So I looked deeper. Social media profiles, college graduation photos, family pictures. It didn't take long to realize that the woman I married isn't a Hamilton. Nicholas, I can explain. You don't need to explain, he said gently. I know why you did it. Your mother needed surgery. The Hamiltons needed the marriage arrangement to save their company, and Tiffany had run off with her boyfriend. You stepped in to save everyone. Kayla stared at him in amazement. How long have you known? 3 weeks, Nicholas admitted. I kept waiting for you to tell me yourself. I wanted to, Kayla said desperately. Especially after we started getting close, after I realized I was falling in love with you. The guilt was eating me alive, but I was terrified you'd hate me for the deception. Hate you? Nicholas's voice was incredulous. Kayla, you sacrificed 2 years of your life to save your mother and a family that took you in when you had nowhere else to go. You agreed to marry a complete stranger to help people you loved. How could I hate you for that kind of selflessness? But I lied to you, Kayla whispered. For 8 months, I let you believe I was someone I'm not. You never lied about who you are, Nicholas said firmly. Your surname might not be Hamilton, but everything else. Your kindness, your strength, your incredible heart, that's all real. That's all you. And your father? What happens when he finds out? Nicholas was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that my father got exactly what he wanted. He wanted someone who would make me more human, more connected to the world beyond business. You did that. The fact that you're Kayla Johnson instead of Kayla Hamilton or Tiffany Hamilton doesn't change the result. What about the Hamiltons? They'll be fine. The company is stable now, and from what I understand, Tiffany's marriage to her musician didn't work out. She'll come home eventually. Nicholas squeezed her hands. But that's not our responsibility anymore. We fulfilled our part of the arrangement, and now we get to choose what comes next. Tears were streaming down Kayla's face. I was so afraid you'd feel betrayed, that you'd think I was just another person who deceived you. Never, Nicholas said fiercely. Charlotte deceived me for her own benefit, to get something she wanted without caring who got hurt. You deceived my father to save your mother's life and help a family in crisis. There's no comparison. No more secrets, Kayla promised. About anything. I want us to start fresh, completely honest with each other. No more secrets, Nicholas agreed, pulling her into his arms. Just us, choosing each other every day. 6 months later, the Hamilton mansion was alive with celebration. The family business had not only recovered, but was thriving under Walter's renewed leadership. And today they were hosting a garden party to celebrate both the company's success and some long overdue family reunions. Mom, this is Nicholas, Kayla said, guiding her fully recovered mother toward where her husband stood chatting with Walter near the rose garden. Nicholas, this is my mother, Elena. Elena Johnson looked exactly like an older version of Kayla, with the same warm smile and intelligent eyes. She walked with a slight cane but moved with the confidence of someone who had fully recovered from her medical crisis. So you're the young man who stole my daughter's heart, Elena said, studying Nicholas with the shrewd assessment that only mothers could manage. Actually, Nicholas replied with the easy smile that had become natural since he'd learned to open his heart again. I think she stole mine first. Good answer. Elena laughed, and Kayla felt a rush of happiness watching the two most important people in her life connect so easily. Across the garden, a taxi pulled up to the mansion's circular driveway. Tiffany Hamilton climbed out, looking older and more subdued than when she'd left almost 2 years ago, but still unmistakably herself. Grace and Walter rushed to meet her, and the reunion was tearful and joyful, full of the forgiveness that only family could offer. She looks different, Kayla observed, watching her former best friend hug her parents. Wiser, maybe, Nicholas suggested. Sometimes the hardest lessons teach us the most. Tiffany spotted them across the garden and made her way over, her expression nervous but determined. "Kayla," she said softly, "I heard what you did. About the arrangement. About marrying Nicholas to save my family and your mother." Her voice broke slightly. "I'm so sorry I ran away and left you to clean up my mess." "You didn't know I'd have to step in," Kayla said gently. "You were following your heart." "My heart led me to someone who only wanted my money," Tiffany replied bitterly. "Zach dumped me the moment he realized I had run out on my savings. Meanwhile, your practical arrangement turned into real love." She looked between Kayla and Nicholas, seeing the way they stood close together, the easy intimacy of people who had chosen each other. "Maybe I should have trusted my parents' judgment after all." "Or maybe," Nicholas said diplomatically, "you needed to learn some things for yourself before you were ready to find the right person." Later that afternoon, as the party wound down, Kayla found herself standing in the garden with her camera, capturing candid moments of celebration and connection. Her photography career had exploded in the past months. 3 gallery showings, a coffee table book deal, and a waiting list of clients who wanted her to capture their most important moments. But the image she treasured most wasn't one she'd taken professionally. It was a photo Grace had snapped earlier of Kayla and Nicholas dancing on the mansion's terrace, both of them laughing, Nicholas steady on his feet, looking at each other like they couldn't believe their good fortune. That evening, back in their apartment, which they'd redecorated together to reflect both their tastes rather than Nicholas's sterile aesthetic, Kayla was uploading the day's photos when Nicholas walked into her studio. He moved with complete confidence now, no trace of the wheelchair that had defined him for 2 years. But more than his physical recovery, it was the openness in his expression, the way he'd learned to let love and joy show on his face, that marked the true extent of his healing. "How did the photos turn out?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her desk. "See for yourself," Kayla said, turning the computer screen so he could see the images from the garden party. "I think I captured some beautiful moments." "You always do," Nicholas said, studying a photo of Tiffany laughing with her parents, all of them crying happy tears. "You have a gift for finding beauty in complicated situations." "I learned from an expert," Kayla replied, leaning over to kiss him softly. "Someone taught me that the most unexpected arrangements can lead to the most beautiful outcomes." "Wise teacher," Nicholas murmured against her lips. As the sun set outside their windows, casting golden light across the studio where Kayla had first begun to build her new life, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. An arranged marriage born of desperation had become the greatest love story of her life. A man who had lost the ability to walk had taught her how to run toward her dreams. A contract that was supposed to last 2 years had become the foundation for a lifetime of choosing each other, day after day. "I love you, Mrs. Anderson," Nicholas said, using her married name with the pride of someone who had earned the right to it through commitment rather than obligation. "I love you too, Mr. Anderson," Kayla replied, then picked up her camera one more time. "Hold still. I want to capture this moment." Through her lens, she saw Nicholas's face filled with the kind of happiness she'd once thought was reserved for fairy tales. Behind him, their life together spread out in beautiful, mundane detail. His therapy certificates on the wall next to her photography awards, their books mingled on the shelves, the throw blanket from that first night when he'd covered her while she slept, draped over the couch they now shared for movie nights. The camera clicked, preserving forever the moment when Kayla Johnson and Nicholas Anderson looked at each other and knew they had found something more precious than any business arrangement. They had found love that grew from choice, commitment that came from the heart, and beauty that emerged from the most unexpected of beginnings. As they kissed in the golden evening light, two people who had started as strangers and learned to become partners in every sense of the word, the city sparkled outside their windows like a promise of all the beautiful moments still to come.